32 years old, and still without a husband. Thessaly's laughter cut through the ballroom like shattered porcelain, while crystal glasses rose around her in celebration. At this point, Father ought to simply send Azenor to manage the livestock. She seems far more comfortable among animals than among civilized company. Soft laughter rippled across the table. Rowan nearly choked on her wine, covering her mouth with silk-gloved fingers, while her shoulders shook with amusement. Azenor sat motionless near the far end of the long table, her hands folded carefully beneath the tablecloth, where nobody could see them trembling. She stared down at the untouched plate before her, while humiliation crawled slowly across her skin. Then, Cressida rose from her chair. With excitement glowing across her entire face, she lifted her left hand high beneath the chandelier light and turned it slowly, so every guest could admire the enormous emerald ring surrounded by clusters of tiny diamonds sparkling against her finger. Hector spent nearly 6,000 pounds on this stone alone. Is it not extraordinary? Though I suppose engagement rings remain rather foreign objects to you, dear sister. Cressida smiled sweetly, while her eyes carried nothing sweet at all. Perhaps a widowed farmer may still wander past the estate searching for a housekeeper, Thessaly added brightly. More laughter filled the ballroom. Lord Hadwin Delvain lifted his wine glass slowly from the head of the table, and the room quieted beneath the weight of his authority. Every daughter seated at this table has honored the Delvain name through worthy marriages and distinguished matches. His voice carried no warmth whatsoever. Then his gaze landed coldly upon Azenor at the opposite end. Every daughter, except one, silence swallowed the hall completely. Every guest turned toward Azenor, the weight of their stares pressed against her chest until breathing itself became painful. She lowered her eyes and slowly pushed her chair backward, preparing to disappear once more into the corridors where nobody would follow. Then something happened that nobody inside Delvain Hall expected. A sound rose from beyond the enormous oak doors. First came the sharp clatter of boots crossing the stone entrance. Then a voice, deep and formal, thundered through the corridor and into the ballroom. His Grace, Duke Bastian Thornvale of Ashenmore. Every head turned instantly. Glasses froze halfway to lips. Thessaly's laughter died immediately in her throat. But it was not the Duke's arrival alone that silenced the room entirely. Perched upon his gloved forearm, hooded and perfectly still, sat the Falcon the whole of England whispered about. Serath, the bird that had not allowed a single living soul, besides the Duke, to touch it in over 12 years. The creature that had drawn blood from lords, generals, and even a member of the royal household, who dared approach it uninvited. The Falcon's silver hood caught the candlelight as the Duke stepped forward into the ballroom. And then, without warning, Serath lifted her wings and launched from his arm. Gasps erupted across the room. Guests stumbled backward from the table. Cressida shrieked and clutched Hector's shoulder. The Falcon swept low across the chandelier light, circled once above the frozen guests, and landed gently upon the shoulder of the woman everyone in the room had just been mocking. Azenor did not move. She barely breathed. The Falcon settled calmly against her neck, pressing its feathered head softly beneath her jaw, as though it had found the one place in the entire world where it felt safe. Duke Bastian Thornvale stood motionless in the doorway, staring at the scene before him with an expression no guest in the room could read. Complete silence held the ballroom like a closed fist. But before we continue, if you enjoy powerful emotional stories filled with betrayal, heartbreak, jealousy, and incredible moments of justice, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you truly want to support us, you can use super thanks below. Your support helps us continue creating these unforgettable stories for you every single day. Now, let us return to where everything began. You are not invisible. You simply live among people who have forgotten how to see. Those words belong to Bethan, the eldest maid at Delvane Hall, spoken quietly one winter morning while she and Azenor folded bed linens together inside the cold servant corridor behind the kitchens. Azenor had smiled faintly at the kindness, but said nothing in return. Kindness spoken aloud always felt fragile to her, as though acknowledging it might cause it to vanish entirely. Delvane Hall stood as one of the grandest aristocratic estates across the northern counties. Towering limestone walls rose 3 stories above manicured gardens, and gravel pathways swept clean every morning before dawn. Inside, endless corridors stretched beneath painted ceilings, where golden-framed portraits of Delvane ancestors watched from the walls with permanent expressions of cold approval. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceilings of every gathering hall, casting warm, fractured light across Persian carpets imported decades earlier from Constantinople. Lord Hadwin Delvane governed the estate and its reputation with obsessive precision. Every social gathering, every dinner invitation, every marriage negotiation inside these walls served one purpose only: protecting the Delvane name. And Azenor had slowly become the name's greatest embarrassment. At 32 years old, she remained unmarried. In the rigid social architecture of Victorian England, that single fact defined everything about how the world treated her. During church services, older women lowered their voices the moment she passed. Younger girls glanced at her with anxious pity, as though she represented a terrifying future awaiting them if they failed to secure a husband in time. At garden gatherings, hostesses seated her beside elderly widows and visiting clergy, safely removed from any conversation where eligible men might notice her. She had heard it all: the whispers after Sunday service, the careful silences when she entered drawing rooms, the way people adjusted their expressions into something resembling sympathy, but containing nothing of the kind. She was attractive once, one woman murmured to another while pouring tea at a charity luncheon the previous autumn. A genuine shame what time does when a woman waits too long. Azenor had kept walking as though she heard nothing. Pain had become something she carried the way one carries a stone inside a coat pocket, always present, never shown. But inside Delvane Hall, her position had shifted into something worse than invisible. She had become useful, not valued, useful. Each morning she rose before the household stirred, reviewing kitchen preparations, checking fireplaces and guest chambers, inspecting table settings, and resolving whatever domestic emergencies the servants brought to her before anyone else woke. She organized flower arrangements for her mother's weekly salons, managed household accounts when the steward fell behind, and soothed arguments between kitchen workers exhausted from endless formal dinners. Nobody thanked her. Nobody acknowledged the labor at all. Her sisters floated through the manor like ornaments placed on display. Thessaly, married to Viscount Pemberley Alcott, visited the estate regularly, wearing new gowns and distributing opinions about curtain fabrics. Rowan, recently engaged to a rising parliamentary figure named Aldrich Cashmane, spent afternoons discussing her future household in London with breathless excitement. And Cressida, the youngest at 23, had just secured the most impressive match of all: wealthy industrialist Hector Grantham, whose family name appeared on factory gates across 3 counties. Lady Fenella Delvane treated each daughter's marriage like a jewel added to the family crown. And she treated Azenor like the empty velvet space where a jewel should have been. One gray Tuesday morning, while rain streaked across the tall kitchen windows and the smell of baking bread and simmering bone broth filled the warm lower corridors, Azenor carried a basket of dried lavender bundles toward the linen room. She paused near the scullery entrance when she heard soft crying. Nettie, the 12-year-old daughter of one of the laundry maids, sat crouched against the stone wall, clutching her right hand against her chest. A bright red burn mark crossed her small fingers, where boiling water from a washing pot had splashed across them minutes earlier. Tears rolled silently down the girl's face while she bit her lip, terrified that crying might draw the attention of the housekeeper, who had already scolded her twice that morning for working too slowly. Azenor knelt beside her immediately. "Let me see, sweetheart." Gently she uncurled the child's trembling fingers and examined the burn carefully. The skin had already begun blistering along the knuckles. Without hesitation, Azenor tore a strip of clean linen from the basket she carried, soaked it in cool water from the stone basin beside the door, and wrapped the girl's hand with practiced care. She reached into her apron pocket and produced a small jar of calendula salve she kept with her constantly, a habit from years of quietly tending to every minor injury the household staff endured but never reported. This will sting just slightly, but by tomorrow, the pain will feel much smaller. Azenor spread the salve gently across the blistered skin, while Nettie watched her with wide, astonished eyes. Nobody of Azenor's standing had ever knelt on a scullery floor to help her before. Azenor pressed a warm bread roll into the girl's uninjured hand, stolen carefully from the breakfast kitchen. "Eat this before anyone notices it missing. And if the burn still hurts tonight, come find me in the garden. I keep more of this salve in the potting shed." Nettie stared at the bread roll and then at Azenor's face with an expression halfway between confusion and something that might have been the beginning of trust. "Thank you, miss." Azenor smoothed the girl's hair back gently, stood, collected her basket, and continued toward the linen room as though nothing important had happened. These moments were the only ones inside Delvane Hall where she still recognized herself, helping someone too small or too powerless for anyone else to notice. Later that same afternoon, while Azenor arranged winter roses inside crystal vases for the drawing room mantelpiece, a visiting baroness from Harrogate entered the room and glanced around impatiently. "You there? Please inform Lady Delvane that the carriage arrangements for Thursday require confirmation." The woman did not look at Azenor directly. Her tone carried the flat efficiency reserved entirely for servants. Azenor set down the crystal vase carefully. "Of course, my lady. I shall pass the message along." The Baroness turned to leave, then paused as recognition flickered briefly across her expression. She opened her mouth as though preparing to apologize, then seemed to decide the correction was not worth the effort, and walked away without another word. Azenor stood alone beside the mantelpiece, while winter light pressed gray and cold through the tall windows. She adjusted the last rose stem into position, brushed a fallen petal from the polished wood, and returned to work. Nobody corrected the Baroness. Nobody ever did. That evening, voices drifted from behind the closed study door as Azenor passed through the corridor, carrying pressed tablecloths for the following morning's breakfast. She recognized her father's measured tone immediately and slowed her steps. "Cressida's match with young Grantham will strengthen our industrial connections considerably," Lord Hadwin was saying. "Every daughter has contributed meaningfully to this family's standing." A guest's voice followed, careful and politely curious. "And your eldest, Hadwin, has there been any recent interest?" Silence stretched through the gap beneath the study door. Azenor stood perfectly still in the dim corridor, the folded linens pressed tightly against her chest. "Some matters," Lord Hadwin replied quietly, "are best left unaddressed." The words entered her body like cold water poured slowly down her spine. She remained frozen for several long seconds, staring at the dark wood grain of the study door. Then she adjusted the linens in her arms and continued walking before anyone inside could hear the sound of her breathing. That night, long after the household fell asleep, Azenor sat alone beside her bedroom window, watching rain trace silver paths down the darkened glass. Somewhere below, a stable hand crossed the courtyard, carrying a lantern through the downpour. Beyond the estate walls, open countryside disappeared into blackness beneath low, heavy clouds. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass and closed her eyes. Somewhere between being overlooked and being erased, she had stopped knowing the difference. The following Sunday, Lady Fenella summoned Azenor to the morning room before breakfast. Pale light filtered through lace curtains, while a silver tea service sat untouched between them on the small round table. Lady Fenella wore a high-collared dress of deep plum silk, her posture straight as iron, her hands folded carefully in her lap. She did not invite Azenor to sit. "I have spoken with your father regarding the Harrogate incident." Azenor blinked. "The Baroness, you mean?" Lady Fenella's expression did not change. "She mistook you for household staff, Azenor, before witnesses. Do you understand how that reflects upon us?" "I was arranging flowers, Mother. I was not dressed for receiving guests because no one informed me guests were arriving that afternoon." Lady Fenella exhaled slowly through her nose. "That is precisely the problem. You have allowed yourself to become indistinguishable from the servants. You spend your mornings in the kitchens. You carry linens through corridors. You kneel on scullery floors, tending to the injuries of laundry children, as though you were the estate nurse, rather than the eldest daughter of Lord Hadwin Delvane." She was hurt. Her hand was badly burned. Lady Fenella raised one hand slightly, and the gesture silenced the room more effectively than any spoken command. "I am not discussing a child's burned fingers. I am discussing your position. Your sisters have secured distinguished marriages. They represent this family with dignity wherever they appear. And you, Azenor, you have become a source of quiet embarrassment that grows louder with every passing season." Azenor felt the words settle into her chest like stones dropped into still water. Each one sank slowly and landed somewhere deep where the hurt collected over years. "What would you have me do?" Lady Fenella studied her eldest daughter carefully. Something almost resembling sadness moved briefly across her expression before discipline replaced it. "I would have you understand that kindness without position is merely servitude, and this family cannot afford a daughter who has chosen servitude over standing." Before Azenor could respond, the morning room door opened, and Lord Hadwin entered, carrying a folded letter. He glanced briefly at Azenor, then addressed Lady Fenella, as though their daughter were not standing 3 feet away. "The Grantham family has confirmed the autumn date for Cressida's celebration. We shall need every room prepared and every detail managed without error." He paused, then added with careful neutrality, "Azenor may oversee the household preparations. She is capable enough for that." The words carried no cruelty in their tone. That was what made them devastating. He had not insulted her. He had simply defined her. She was capable enough to serve, nothing more. That evening, after the household retired, Azenor passed the study on her way to the garden and heard her parents speaking behind the partially open door. Lady Fenella's voice carried first. "Once Cressida's wedding concludes, we must address the matter properly. Aunt Dorothea's cottage near Whitborough remains available. It is modest, but respectable enough to avoid scandal." Lord Hadwin's reply came after a long pause. "People have already begun speculating. The longer she remains here unmarried, the more attention it draws. A quiet relocation would end the conversation entirely." Azenor pressed her back against the corridor wall. Her fingers gripped the fabric of her skirt, while the breath inside her chest turned sharp and shallow. They were not discussing her future. They were arranging her disappearance. She stood frozen in the darkened hallway for what felt like entire minutes. Then she released the fabric, straightened her posture, and walked silently toward the garden door without making a sound. Behind her, the study conversation continued, as though nothing of consequence had been decided at all. Preparations for Cressida's engagement celebration consumed Delvane Hall for nearly 3 weeks. Crates of French wine packed in straw arrived daily at the servants' entrance, alongside bolts of ivory silk, enormous glass lanterns etched with the Delvane crest, and barrels of preserved lemons and dried rose petals imported from merchants along the southern coast. Carpenters constructed a temporary platform inside the ballroom for the musicians. Gardeners transplanted white roses into stone urns flanking the main entrance. The kitchen staff worked in rotations from before dawn until past midnight, filling the lower corridors with the constant warm scent of roasted meats, pastry cream, and slow-simmered sauces thickened with butter and wine. Azanor managed everything. She woke each morning before 5 and did not sit down until after 11 at night. She coordinated deliveries, resolved disputes between the head cook and pastry chef, personally inspected each of the 14 guest chambers, and reorganized the seating arrangement 4 times after Lady Fenella changed her mind about positioning. Her hands ached constantly. Her lower back carried a dull, persistent pain from hours spent bending over table settings, adjusting centerpieces, and hauling crates of silverware between the storage cellar and the dining hall. Dark circles deepened beneath her eyes, while exhaustion settled permanently into her posture. Nobody noticed. Nobody asked whether she had eaten. Nobody offered assistance. Meanwhile, Cressida moved through the estate like a woman already crowned. Her engagement gown, a breathtaking creation of pale champagne satin layered with hand-stitched lace imported from Brussels, arrived in a velvet-lined trunk carried by 2 men. Diamond earrings borrowed from Lady Fenella's private collection rested against her throat during fittings, while 3 seamstresses adjusted her hemline on their knees. "You missed a water stain on the 3rd-floor landing," Cressida mentioned carelessly one afternoon, while passing Azanor in the corridor. Her eyes never lifted from the embroidered handkerchief she was examining. "Honestly, Azanor, if the household falls apart before Saturday, everyone will know precisely who was responsible." Azanor cleaned the stain herself within the hour. On the morning of the celebration, Thessaly arrived early with Viscount Alcott, sweeping through the entrance hall in a gown of deep burgundy velvet, while servants carried her luggage upstairs. She found Azanor in the ballroom adjusting candle placements inside the glass lanterns. "My goodness, you look exhausted." Thessaly tilted her head with the particular brand of sympathy designed entirely for an audience. She glanced sideways at Rowan, who had arrived moments earlier and stood nearby adjusting her gloves. "You know, sister, you truly have found your calling. Managing households suits you so naturally." Rowan smiled behind her fan. "Perhaps once all 3 of us have our own estates, we can simply hire Azanor to manage them." They laughed together, while Azanor continued adjusting the candles without responding. She had learned years ago that silence hurt less than any response she could offer. By evening, the estate glowed beneath hundreds of candles, reflected against polished marble floors and towering mirrors lining the ballroom walls. Guests arrived in waves. Carriages lined the front drive, while footmen in pressed black coats opened doors and guided visitors through the entrance hall, where the scent of white roses and warm beeswax candles hung sweetly in the air. Long banquet tables stretched the entire length of the dining hall, covered in pressed ivory cloth and set with polished silver. Platters of roasted venison glazed with blackcurrant sauce, creamed potatoes seasoned with thyme, buttered asparagus tied in delicate bundles, smoked trout arranged on beds of watercress, warm bread rolls brushed with honey butter, and towering displays of sugared fruit and layered cream pastries covered every surface. Cressida stood at the center of the ballroom beside Hector Grantham, her emerald ring catching the candlelight with every gesture. Hector smiled broadly while shaking hands with guests and discussing factory production figures with anyone willing to listen. During supper, an elderly countess seated near the middle of the table leaned toward Azenor with gentle curiosity. "You are Lord Hadwin's eldest, are you not? A lovely young woman. Tell me, dear, when might we expect an announcement of your own?" The question pressed against a bruise so deep that Azenor felt the ache reach her spine. Before she could form a polite response, Thessaly answered from across the table. "Azenor keeps rather occupied with household duties. She has become quite indispensable in that regard." The Countess looked momentarily confused, uncertain whether she had just received an answer or witnessed something cruel. Rowan filled the silence smoothly. "Not everyone is destined for marriage, of course. Some women find purpose in other ways." She smiled warmly enough to disguise the blade inside the words. Cressida added the final strike. She leaned forward and placed one hand gently over Azenor's, her voice sweet enough to draw admiring glances from nearby guests who could not hear the cruelty buried beneath it. "We are simply grateful Azenor is here to ensure everything runs so beautifully. Honestly, what would this family do without her quiet dedication?" Several guests murmured agreement. A few even nodded with admiration, entirely unaware they were watching a woman being buried alive beneath kindness shaped into a coffin. Azenor smiled because smiling was what she had been trained to do. She excused herself from the table shortly afterward and walked through the service corridor toward the rear of the house, where the noise of the celebration dimmed to a muffled hum behind heavy walls. She pushed open the garden door and stepped outside into the cold October air. Stars filled the black sky above the estate grounds, while frost had already begun to silver the edges of the stone pathway beneath her feet. Her breath formed small white clouds that vanished instantly into the darkness. From inside the ballroom, she could hear laughter, music, the clinking of glasses raised in celebration of another daughter's success, another sister leaving her behind. Azenor pressed both palms flat against the frozen garden wall and lowered her head until her forehead touched the cold stone. She stayed that way for a long time, while the celebration continued without her, exactly as she knew it would. Long before silence became permanent inside Azenor Delvain, there had once been light. At 21, she moved through the world with openness in her eyes and curiosity in her voice that made people lean closer whenever she spoke. She read extensively. History, natural philosophy, botanical studies, and long accounts of expeditions to distant coastlines written by explorers who described foreign birds and unfamiliar weather patterns with the kind of wonder she recognized in herself. She played the harp beside open garden windows during summer evenings, filling the estate corridors with soft, cascading notes that made even the kitchen staff pause their work to listen. During dinner parties, she asked genuine questions of guests, surprising visiting academics with the depth of her reading and embarrassing more than one young nobleman who discovered she understood subjects they only pretended to know. She was alive in a way that made the air around her feel warmer. That was before Emmerich Ashvine arrived at Delvain Hall. Emmerich came to the estate accompanying a professor of natural history, whom Lord Hadwin had invited to catalog the rare bird species nesting along the river woodlands bordering the Delvain property. The professor was elderly and preferred to work from the library, studying specimens brought to him by his assistant. Emmerich was that assistant. He was not wealthy. He carried no title. His coat was worn at the elbows, his boots resoled twice, and his hands roughened from years of fieldwork in forests and coastal marshes. But something about the way he moved through the world made Azenor notice him immediately. He walked quietly, listened carefully, and treated every person he encountered with the same steady, unhurried respect. Their first real conversation happened beside the river on a cold morning during his second week at the estate. Azenor had walked down to the water to collect wild mint for the kitchen when she found Emmerich crouched motionless among the reeds, watching a kingfisher perched on a low branch above the current. He did not hear her approach. She stood several feet behind him, watching him watch the bird. And something about his stillness, his patience, the way he seemed willing to wait indefinitely for the creature to trust the silence around it, made her feel a recognition she could not explain. "You will frighten it if you breathe any louder," he said without turning around. Azenor nearly laughed. "I was not the one crouched in a marsh at 7 in the morning." He turned then, and his expression carried the beginning of a smile that reached his eyes before it reached his mouth. Fair point. After that morning, they found each other constantly, not by arrangement, but by a kind of gravity neither of them named aloud. He showed her how to identify birds by their songs alone, standing with eyes closed among the beech trees, while he named each call as it appeared. She brought him books from the estate library, and they discussed them during walks along the river path, while autumn leaves drifted across the water. He taught her how wild creatures decide whether to trust. It is never about size, or loudness, or intention, he explained one afternoon, while they watched a sparrowhawk circle above the meadow. It is about stillness. Animals do not hear your words. They read the quality of your silence. A frightened person, an angry person, a dishonest person. They all carry noise inside their bodies that animals can sense before a single word is spoken. Trust is given only to those who carry genuine quiet within them. Azenor listened to those words with the attention of someone hearing something important for the first time. He asked about her thoughts, her interests, the ideas she kept hidden during dinner parties, because nobody had ever wanted to hear them. He laughed at her observations about the absurdity of aristocratic social rituals. She laughed at his stories about sleeping in barns and being chased by geese during fieldwork expeditions gone wrong. For the first time in her life, Azenor felt chosen for the person she actually was, not the family she represented, or the marriage prospects she was supposed to embody. Even Bethan noticed the change. "You have been smiling again," the maid said quietly one morning while helping Azenor dress for breakfast. The observation made Azenor blush so deeply she turned away from the mirror. But happiness inside Delvain Hall had never been allowed to survive unchallenged. One evening in late November, Lord Hadwin returned early from a ride and found Azenor and Emmerich walking together along the garden path near the south wall. Their conversation was entirely innocent. Emmerich had been describing the migratory patterns of Arctic terns, and Azenor had been listening with visible fascination. But their closeness, the warmth between them, the way Azenor's face carried an expression Lord Hadwin had never seen directed toward any man of suitable rank, was enough. The atmosphere inside the study that night could have frozen the river solid. Lord Hadwin's voice struck the walls like a hammer against stone. "You pursued my daughter, knowing full well you possess neither name, nor fortune, nor any standing whatsoever within respectable society." Emmerich stood before the desk, with his shoulders straight despite the fury directed at him. He did not flinch. He did not retreat. "My feelings for your daughter are sincere, my lord. I would ask only the opportunity to prove that sincerity through time." Lord Hadwin leaned forward across the desk. Sincerity does not fund estates. Sincerity does not protect family legacies. And sincerity most certainly does not entitle a field researcher earning a professor's charity wages to place his affections upon a Delvain daughter. "Father, please." Azenor stepped forward from the doorway, where she had been standing with tears already building behind her eyes. "If you would simply allow time for his circumstances to improve. He's brilliant. He's respected in his field. His work matters." Lord Hadwin silenced her with a single raised hand. His work matters to science, perhaps. It means nothing to this family. Lady Fenella, standing near the window throughout the confrontation, added the final weight with devastating calm. Society will not forgive this match, Azenor, and we will not survive the reputation it would create. You must understand that. Emmerich was instructed to leave the estate before dawn. No further contact would be permitted. Lord Hadwin made the consequences explicitly clear. If Emmerich attempted to write, visit, or communicate with Azenor in any form, the professor who employed him would be informed that his assistant had behaved dishonorably toward a nobleman's daughter, effectively ending his career and his livelihood permanently. The following morning arrived wrapped in freezing rain. Azenor found Emmerich waiting near the garden gate beside a hired carriage. His single leather trunk sat on the wet gravel beside the wheels. Rain soaked through his coat while water dripped steadily from the brim of his hat. She could barely speak. Her throat had closed around something that felt permanent. Emmerich took her hands gently inside his own. His fingers were cold, but his grip was steady. I will find a way back to you. He spoke the words quietly enough that only she could hear them above the rain. I do not know how long it will take, but I will earn enough, build enough, become enough that no one can deny what exists between us. Azenor shook her head, while tears mixed with rainwater across her cheeks. You are already enough. You have always been enough. He pressed his forehead against hers for a brief moment. Then he released her hands, climbed into the carriage, and did not look back as the wheels began to turn. Azenor watched the carriage until it disappeared beyond the hill, where the road curved into the gray countryside. The rain continued long after he was gone. She remained standing at the gate until Bethan came to bring her inside, wrapping a wool shawl around her trembling shoulders without saying a word. For 7 months afterward, Azenor waited. She checked the Morning Post before anyone else woke. She watched the road from her bedroom window during afternoons, when the light was clear enough to see the distant curve where carriages first appeared. She wrote letters she could never send, and kept them pressed inside a volume of botanical illustrations Emmerich had once borrowed from the library, and returned with small pencil notes written in the margins beside drawings of migratory birds. Then one February evening, while sleet battered the estate windows and the household gathered around the drawing-room fire, a letter arrived. Not from Emmerich. The letter came from a colleague of the professor. Emmerich had accepted a research commission aboard a survey vessel bound for the northern Scottish coastline, hoping the expedition's wages and published findings would establish the independent reputation he needed to return for Azenor, with standing no one could challenge. The vessel had been caught in a storm off the coast of Caithness during the worst winter gales in 14 years. It went down with all hands. No survivors were recovered. Azenor remembered the exact moment Bethan handed her the letter. She remembered the way the paper felt between her fingers. She remembered the fire crackling in the grate and the sound of Thessaly laughing about something trivial in the next room. She remembered looking down at the words and reading them twice because the first time they did not seem to be real. The teacup she had been holding slipped from her other hand and shattered across the hardwood floor. Bethan caught her arm as her knees buckled. She locked herself inside her bedroom for 6 days. She refused meals, refused conversation, refused sunlight. Lady Fenella knocked twice and eventually stopped. Lord Hadwin never knocked at all. When Azenor finally emerged, something behind her eyes had changed permanently. The warmth, the curiosity, the openness that once made people lean closer when she spoke, all of it had retreated somewhere deep inside her chest and sealed itself shut like a door locked from within. She resumed her duties inside the household quietly. She arranged flowers. She supervised kitchens. She managed accounts and smoothed disputes and folded linens and carried trays and did everything that was asked of her without complaint, without expression, without expectation. The woman who once played the harp beside open windows, while summer air filled the corridors, never touched the instrument again. Thessaly married Viscount Pemberley Alcott 3 months later, in a ceremony that filled the estate chapel with imported lilies and drew guests from across 4 counties. Azenor stood silently near the stone steps while the bridal carriage departed beneath spring sunshine. She held her gloves tightly against the cold inside her chest and watched another sister leave. Rowan's engagement to Aldrich Cashmane followed the next autumn. The celebration was smaller, but no less painful. During supper, Rowan reached across the table and squeezed Azenor's hand, with gentle sympathy, visible enough for every guest nearby to witness. "You must not lose hope, dear sister. Your time will come." Azenor smiled politely and said nothing. The sympathy felt rehearsed, performed for an audience, rather than offered in private where it might have meant something real. Later that evening, she overheard Rowan speaking quietly to Aldrich in the drawing room. "He seems attentive enough during gatherings," Rowan was saying about a visiting lord who had briefly spoken to Azenor during dinner, but even he would likely consider her too old for a serious match. Aldrich murmured something Azenor could not hear. Rowan sighed. "It is sad, truly. But some situations simply cannot be helped." Azenor walked away from the door before hearing more. She climbed the staircase to her room, sat beside the window in the dark, and watched the distant lights of the celebration below flicker against the glass like small, trapped flames struggling to stay alive. Each wedding, each engagement, each celebration. They arrived with the regularity of seasons, and each one removed another piece of Azenor from the family she lived among. She was not being rejected violently. She was being left behind gradually, the way a shoreline disappears when a boat moves slowly enough that no single moment marks the departure. By the time Cressida's engagement to Hector Grantham was announced, Azenor had stopped watching the road from her window entirely. She no longer checked the Morning Post. She no longer played music. She no longer surprised dinner guests with her reading or made kitchen staff pause their work by filling corridors with harp notes that sounded like something beautiful remembering itself. She had become exactly what her family needed her to be: quiet, useful, invisible. And somewhere deep within the woodlands along the northern coast, inside an enormous stone manor perched above black cliffs where the sea battered the rocks below, another person had learned the same lesson from the opposite end of the world entirely. Across the northern counties of England, the name Bastian Thornvale carried a weight that made powerful men choose their words with unusual care. His estates stretched across thousands of acres of coastline, forests, and farmland. Shipping ports along the eastern seaboard bore the Thornvale crest. Factories in 3 cities operated under contracts he had negotiated personally before turning 30. Politicians consulted him before introducing legislation. Bankers adjusted terms without argument when his solicitors appeared. At 37 years old, Duke Bastian Thornvale had become one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in England, and yet people feared him nearly as deeply as they admired him. Ashenmore Manor stood on a cliff above the northern coast, like a fortress carved from the landscape itself. Dark stone walls rose against the gray sky, battered constantly by sea wind and salt air. Inside, enormous hallways stretched between towering fireplaces, where flames crackled against the silence that seemed to follow Bastian through every room. Servants moved carefully through the manor, speaking only when addressed, avoiding unnecessary conversation whenever the Duke passed. Bastian rarely smiled anymore. Most evenings, he sat alone inside his private study, surrounded by shipping ledgers and parliamentary correspondence, while wind howled against the tall windows overlooking the sea below. invitations to balls and society events accumulated unopened across his desk. Romance held no interest for him. Trust held even less. The only living creature Bastian trusted completely sat perched on an iron stand beside his desk every evening. Serath. He had found her 12 years earlier during a storm along the coastal cliffs, a young peregrine falcon with a damaged wing, soaked and trembling inside a crevice between the rocks. He carried her inside his coat back to the manor, set the wing himself using techniques learned from an old falconer who had served his father, and fed her by hand for weeks until she recovered. From the moment she healed, Serath bonded to Bastian with a ferocity that startled even experienced falconers who visited the estate. She would not tolerate another person's touch. She would not accept food from another hand. Guests who attempted to approach her found themselves met with a display of raised wings, sharp talons, and a scream piercing enough to silence entire rooms. Over the years, Serath's reputation grew alongside Bastian's own. A visiting general once extended a gloved hand toward the falcon during a hunting party, and Serath struck with enough force to draw blood through the leather. A member of the royal household attempted to handle her during a formal estate visit, and she tore the silk lining from his sleeve before Bastian intervened. After a decade of such incidents, people stopped trying. The falcon was considered untouchable, wild despite domestication, loyal to one person alone. Bastian understood the bird's nature because he recognized it inside himself. Years earlier, before the silence and the isolation took permanent hold, London society had watched his courtship of Lady Lysara Corven unfold like a story written for admiration. Lysara possessed the kind of beauty that altered the atmosphere of any room she entered. She spoke 4 languages, discussed politics with confidence that impressed seasoned parliamentarians, and directed all of it toward Bastian with a focus so complete that society itself declared them inevitable. Bastian believed her entirely. He gifted her jewelry that had belonged to his late mother, introduced her to his closest political allies, and discussed marriage openly before aristocratic society. For the first time since inheriting his father's enormous and lonely estate, he permitted himself to believe that companionship built on genuine affection might actually exist. The destruction arrived not through whispered confessions, but through intercepted documents. A parliamentary associate loyal to Bastian quietly presented him with a collection of private letters recovered from the desk of Lord Caverstone, a political rival whose efforts to undermine Thornvale shipping contracts had been escalating for months. The letters were written in Lysara's hand. They detailed private conversations she had shared with Bastian about pending trade legislation, shipping route negotiations, and confidential parliamentary strategies. She had been passing information to Caverstone for nearly the entire duration of their courtship, helping him position rival interests against Thornvale assets, while publicly performing devotion, convincing enough to fool everyone who watched. The betrayal was not merely romantic, it was strategic, calculated, professional. When Bastian confronted her inside his London townhouse, Lysara did not cry. She did not deny. She simply looked at him with the same composed intelligence she had always carried, and spoke with devastating clarity. You were never difficult to admire, Bastian, but admiration and love are not the same thing. Caverstone offered me influence you would never have shared willingly. I simply chose the more practical arrangement. The words did not wound him the way a confession of passion for another man might have. They destroyed something far deeper. They confirmed that everything he had experienced as genuine connection had been performance from the first conversation to the last. Every intimate evening, every private laugh, every moment he had interpreted as proof that someone saw him rather than his title or fortune had been theater constructed for strategic advantage. The humiliation spread through London society within days. At private clubs, men exchanged knowing glances, At opera houses, women whispered behind fans. The powerful Duke of Ashenmoor, deceived entirely by a woman who had never felt a genuine emotion toward him in her life. What destroyed Bastian most completely was not the public embarrassment. It was discovering that he could not identify the difference between authentic affection and skilled performance. If Lysera had fooled him so thoroughly, then every smile, every kind word, every display of warmth from anyone around him became suspect. After that winter, Bastian withdrew from society almost entirely. Women continued pursuing him at the rare events he attended. Ambitious mothers engineered introductions. Beautiful young noblewomen positioned themselves near him during dinners, laughing too brightly and complimenting his estates with carefully rehearsed enthusiasm. He responded to all of it with polite distance that never wavered. Many women called him cold. Others called him arrogant. The truth was far simpler. Bastian no longer believed that warmth offered to a man of his wealth and power could ever be separated from what that wealth and power represented. One evening in early autumn, Dowager Duchess Marguerite Thornvale entered his study carrying a tray of roasted pheasant, warm bread, and black tea. She had noticed him skip supper for the third consecutive evening and had prepared the tray herself rather than sending a servant. "You cannot spend your remaining years talking exclusively to a falcon," she said quietly, while setting the tray beside the fireplace. Bastian did not look up from his correspondence. "Serath does not lie to me." Marguerite studied her son with the careful attention of a woman who understood that the sharpness in his face had not always been there. He had been warmer once, open once, before Lysera dismantled something inside him that she feared might never be rebuilt. "She deceived you. But not every woman alive is Lady Lysera." Bastian glanced toward the rain-streaked windows. Most are simply more patient about revealing it. The Dowager Duchess left the study quietly, but her worry remained long after the door closed behind her. More than anything, she feared her son would spend his entire life surrounded by wealth, power, and silence, with only a falcon for companionship, and die without ever allowing another human being close enough to prove him wrong. Several days later, a formal invitation arrived from Lord Hadwin Delvane, requesting Bastian's attendance at the engagement celebration of his youngest daughter, Cressida. Under ordinary circumstances, Bastian would have added it to the unopened pile. But Lord Hadwin held growing influence among several industrial investors, connected to Thornvale shipping interests along the northern routes. Refusing entirely risked creating political friction that served no strategic purpose. Bastian studied the invitation for a long moment before placing it aside. "You intend to attend?" his butler asked with carefully measured surprise. "For one evening," Bastian replied without expression. "Nothing more." The night of the celebration arrived beneath heavy clouds and cold October wind. Servants fastened Bastian's dark coat, while stable hands prepared the carriage outside the manor entrance. Serath sat hooded and motionless on his gloved forearm as he stepped into the cold night air. Inside the carriage, silence surrounded him, except for the rhythmic sound of wheels turning against the wet gravel road. As the journey continued through the dark countryside, distant candlelight from Delvane Hall slowly appeared ahead through the trees. Bastian leaned back against the leather seat and expected nothing from the evening except obligation fulfilled and an early departure. Another ballroom filled with performances. Another evening surrounded by people who wanted something from him while pretending otherwise. The carriage rolled forward through the iron gates of the estate while rain began to fall. The moment Duke Bastian Thornvale entered the ballroom of Delvane Hall, the atmosphere shifted as though someone had altered the pressure inside the room. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Music softened uncertainly. Women throughout the hall straightened their posture, while mothers pulled daughters closer. whispering rapid instructions behind decorated fans. Lord Hadwin crossed the ballroom personally to greet him, barely concealing the excitement of a man who understood exactly what the Duke's presence signified for the family's social standing. Lady Fenella smiled with a warmth she typically reserved for guests whose importance exceeded her own. Sereth remained hooded on Bastian's forearm throughout the formal greetings, perfectly still, though several guests stepped noticeably wider around the Duke, aware of the Falcon's reputation. Several young noblewomen attempted conversation throughout the first hour, each one performing some version of charm that felt rehearsed before it reached his ears. Bastian responded courteously to each one, and felt nothing from any of them. Then, midway through the evening, something quiet caught his attention. Near the far wall of the ballroom, partially hidden behind a column of white roses, a woman knelt on the stone floor beside an elderly gentleman who had stumbled while rising from his chair. The man's wineglass had shattered beside him, and a dark stain spread across the knee of his trousers, while embarrassment colored his face. Several guests nearby had stepped backward instinctively, wearing the careful blankness of people who did not wish to involve themselves in someone else's difficulty. The woman kneeling beside him spoke quietly enough that her words did not carry across the room. She steadied the old man's arm with one hand, while using the other to gather the broken glass carefully, placing each piece onto a linen napkin she had pulled from the nearest table. A servant hurried over, but the woman had already wrapped the gentleman's cut palm with a strip of cloth produced from somewhere inside her sleeve, speaking gently while her fingers worked with the practiced ease of someone who had done this many times before. The old man's embarrassment slowly dissolved beneath her calm attention. He nodded gratefully, while she helped him back into his chair and signaled a servant to bring fresh water and a clean napkin, without raising her voice above a murmur. Nobody else in the room appeared to notice the scene at all. But Bastian noticed. He noticed her composure. He noticed the absence of performance in her movements. He noticed that she did not glance around the room to see whether anyone important was watching her kindness, and he noticed, with a recognition that struck something deep and unprepared inside his chest, that she returned afterward to a position near the wall where she stood alone, holding a glass she had not touched, watching the celebration continue around her as though she existed slightly outside of it. On his forearm, Sereth stirred beneath her hood. Bastian also noticed what happened during supper. The eldest daughter, the same woman who had knelt beside the fallen gentleman, sat near the far end of the table, while her three sisters occupied positions of prominence beside their husbands and betrothed. He watched the youngest sister place a hand over the eldest's with exaggerated tenderness and heard the words clearly enough across the table. "We are simply grateful you are here to keep everything running so beautifully." Honestly, what would we do without you? Guests murmured agreement. Several smiled warmly toward the eldest daughter. None of them recognized what Bastian saw immediately. The affection was a cage built from kind words, and the woman sitting inside it had long ago stopped trying to escape. On his arm, Sereth shifted again. Her talons tightened against the leather glove. A low sound rose from beneath her hood, something between a cry and a tremor, directed toward the far end of the table where the eldest daughter sat. Bastian watched the woman excuse herself quietly from the table. He watched her walk toward the rear of the ballroom, with her shoulders held straight and her hands clasped together to prevent anyone from seeing them shake. And something that had been frozen inside him for years cracked slightly without warning. Then Sereth moved. Without signal, without provocation, the Falcon lifted her wings and launched from Bastian's arm with a force that startled every guest within 15 feet. Gasps erupted across the ballroom. Chairs scraped backward against marble. Cressida clutched Hector's shoulder and released a sharp cry of alarm. Lord Hadwin rose from his seat with visible panic, while Lady Fenella pressed one hand against her chest. The Falcon rose above the chandelier light, turned sharply against the painted ceiling, and glided down toward the far end of the ballroom, where the eldest daughter had paused near the doorway. Sarath alighted upon her shoulder with a gentleness that contradicted every violent encounter the bird had ever had with another human being, and tucked her feathered head beneath the woman's jaw with the quiet certainty of a creature that had finally, after 12 years, found something it recognized. Azenor stood absolutely still. Her breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat. Her eyes widened with shock, but her body carried the instinctive quiet that Emmerich had once told her animals could sense before a single word was spoken. The ballroom held its silence like a held breath. Bastian stood motionless across the room. The Falcon that had drawn blood from generals and refused the hand of royalty had chosen this woman. This overlooked, mocked, invisible woman standing alone near the doorway of her own family's celebration. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The candles flickered against the mirrors, while the entire ballroom waited for something to break the impossible stillness. Then Bastian walked forward. He crossed the ballroom slowly, deliberately, while every pair of eyes followed his movement. He passed Cressida without glancing at her ring. He passed Thessaly and Rowan without acknowledging their frozen expressions. He stopped directly before Azenor, who looked up at him with visible shock, while Sarath remained settled peacefully against her neck. "She has never done this before," Bastian said quietly. His voice carried clearly enough for the nearest guests to hear, though he spoke only to her. Not once in 12 years. Azenor's voice barely held. "I did not call her. I did not do anything." A faint expression crossed Bastian's face, something that was not quite a smile, but carried the weight of recognition that comes from seeing something you had stopped believing existed. "I know," he said. "That is precisely why she came." The silence stretched another moment. Then Bastian extended one hand gently. "Miss Delvain, would you permit me the honor of your company for the evening? I believe Sarath has made her preference rather clear, and I have learned over many years never to question her judgment." Azenor stared at his outstretched hand. Behind her, she could feel the weight of every stare in the ballroom pressing against her back. Her sister sat frozen at the supper table. Her father had not closed his mouth. Her mother gripped the edge of the tablecloth with both hands. The woman who had not been chosen for anything in over a decade placed her trembling fingers carefully into the Duke's hand. The orchestra resumed playing. Bastian guided Azenor gently into the center of the ballroom, while Sarath remained perched calmly on her shoulder, undisturbed by the movement, the music, or the hundreds of astonished eyes watching from every direction. Azenor moved nervously at first, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of everything she had come to expect from evenings like this. "You seem uncomfortable," Bastian observed quietly, as they moved together beneath the chandeliers. "I am unaccustomed to being seen." The honesty in those words struck him harder than any practiced charm ever could have. Throughout the remainder of the dance, Azenor never once mentioned his wealth. She never referenced his title or his influence in Parliament. She spoke about the music, about the strange comfort of autumn rain, about how gatherings like these always felt louder than the number of people in them should produce. When the dance ended, whispers had already begun spreading through the room like fire through dry grass. Why her? He ignored every woman in London and chose the one her own family mocks openly. Did you see the Falcon? 12 years without landing on another soul. Across the ballroom, Thessaly's wine glass trembled visibly in her hand. Cressida stared at her sister as though watching a stranger. Rowan's face held something colder than shock. It held the beginning of fear. And Lord Hadwin Delvain sat perfectly still at the head of his table, watching his eldest daughter walk beside the most powerful duke in England, and realized for the first time that he had been looking at the wrong daughter his entire life. In the weeks following the celebration, Duke Bastian Thornvale began appearing at Delvane Hall with a frequency that made servants prepare his preferred tea the moment his carriage appeared on the distant road. At first, society treated his visits as aristocratic curiosity. Then London newspapers began printing carefully worded observations about the unusual attention the Duke of Ashenmore appeared to be giving Lord Hadwin Delvane's unmarried eldest daughter. Gossip traveled through drawing rooms, theater lobbies, and church gatherings with astonishing speed. Perhaps Thornvale merely pities her. No man of his standing visits repeatedly without serious intention. Surely he cannot truly admire Miss Delvane when half the young women in England have been throwing themselves at him for years. Inside the manor, everything transformed overnight. Lord Hadwin suddenly invited Azenor to sit beside important guests during supper and introduced her to wealthy associates as though he had always valued her presence. Lady Fenella's transformation was even more dramatic. Expensive gowns began arriving from London weekly, deep sapphire silk, cream satin trimmed with silver thread, and embroidered cashmere shawls filled Azenor's wardrobe, while her mother hovered constantly before every gathering. "You must wear your hair pinned higher. It lengthens the neck," Lady Fenella instructed, while repositioning pearl combs in Azenor's dark hair. The Duke notices refinement. Azenor barely recognized the sudden attention after years of calculated invisibility. But her sisters recognized it immediately, and they despised it. Thessaly's bitterness had been sharpening for months. Viscount Alcott's gambling debts had surfaced publicly, humiliating Thessaly before the very people she had spent years impressing. Their marriage had become a private landscape of shouting and long silences. Rowan's loneliness deepened differently. Aldrich Cashmane treated her less like a wife and more like a decorative fixture inside his political career, attending dinners when her presence benefited his reputation and vanishing the moment her usefulness expired. Cressida's glamorous match darkened fastest of all. Hector Grantham revealed a controlling temperament that tightened around her life with each passing month. He monitored her correspondence, questioned her spending, and criticized everything from her clothing to her conversation with a coldness that made her doubt whether the man she married and the man she lived with were the same person. Yet none of the sisters examined their own choices. They examined Azenor. One afternoon, Thessaly sat rigidly inside the drawing room, turning her wineglass between restless fingers while rain streaked down the windows. "She engineered this," Thessaly muttered bitterly. No man of Thornvale's position notices a woman like Azenor without manipulation. She has played the victim so convincingly that he has fallen for the performance entirely. Rowan remained quieter, but no less sharp. Men like the Duke enjoy rescuing women they perceive as helpless. It feeds their sense of importance. Once the novelty fades, he will lose interest and move on. Cressida's teacup struck the saucer hard enough to crack the porcelain. "She is humiliating us deliberately. Every visit, every newspaper mention, every whispered conversation inside every drawing room in London is designed to remind society that we married poorly while she waited for something better." The jealousy poisoned every interaction and spread steadily into society through whispers Thessaly encouraged privately while maintaining innocence publicly. Rumors circulated that Azenor had manipulated the Duke through calculated vulnerability, that the Falcon incident had been staged through some unknown trickery. Rowan went further. During a formal dinner in London, she arranged for Lady Lysara Corvin to attend the same gathering where Bastian would be present. Lysara arrived in midnight blue velvet, her composure as perfectly assembled as it had been during every private betrayal years earlier. Throughout the evening, she positioned herself near Bastian, referencing shared memories with the practiced intimacy of someone who understood how to make a new relationship feel inadequate beside the shadow of an old one. Azanor watched from across the room, while something sharp tightened inside her chest. Lysara leaned closer toward Bastion and said quietly, "You carried yourself with more ease before you became so guarded. The world is less interesting when you hold it at arm's length." Bastion's expression hardened like stone exposed to sudden frost. "I was not less guarded before. I was merely less informed." Lysara's smile vanished. The rejection carried the weight of absolute finality, and several nearby guests who overheard the exchange turned away in visible discomfort. Later that same week, Bastion returned unexpectedly to Delvain Hall after realizing he had left correspondence inside Lord Hadwin's study. Walking through the corridor toward the drawing room, he heard voices sharp enough to stop him before he reached the door. Thessaly's voice carried clearly through the gap. She parades around the estate, pretending humility, while the entire county watches her chase a man who will inevitably grow bored. Cressida laughed bitterly. At 32, she would cling to any wealthy man willing to glance in her direction. She is simply fortunate this one has not come to his senses yet. Rowan added with quiet precision, "Perhaps once the novelty wears thin, things may return to their natural order." Bastion's jaw tightened until the muscles along his neck became visible beneath his collar. Without hesitation, he pushed the drawing room door open. The three sisters froze instantly. The color left Thessaly's face in a single breath. Cressida lowered her teacup with trembling hands. Rowan could not meet his eyes. Bastion stood in the doorway for a moment that stretched long enough to become unbearable before he spoke. "Tell me," he said calmly, his voice controlled, but carrying an edge sharp enough to cut glass. "What precisely has Miss Delvain done to earn this contempt? Has she betrayed someone's trust? Has she manipulated someone's affections for personal advantage? Has she ever spoken a single cruel word about any of you behind closed doors, the way you have just spoken about her?" Nobody answered. "Because I have watched her tend to injured servants while you adjusted your jewelry. I have watched her comfort frightened children while you discussed silk imports. I have watched her endure public humiliation from her own family with more composure than most people demonstrate during their proudest moments." Bastion's gaze moved slowly from one sister to the next. "Azanor possesses more genuine dignity than anyone I have encountered inside this household, and the cruelty you direct toward her reveals nothing about her character. It reveals everything about your own." He turned and walked from the room before anyone could respond. The silence he left behind pressed against the walls like something with physical weight. That evening, Azanor stood alone beside the darkened garden windows, while rain traced silver lines down the glass. She had not heard the confrontation, but something in the household's atmosphere had shifted in a way she could sense without understanding. She did not hear Bastion approach until his reflection appeared faintly in the window glass beside her own. She turned, and he saw immediately that she had been crying. She wiped her face quickly, embarrassed by the exposure, but the evidence remained in the redness around her eyes and the slight tremor in her breathing. They spoke for a long time about the things Azanor had never been able to say aloud to anyone, about the years of silence, about the slow erosion of being overlooked until you forget what being seen feels like, about Emmerich, though she did not speak his name. She described him only as someone she had lost, someone who had once made her believe she was worth choosing, and whose absence had made her quietly accept that perhaps she was not. "No one has ever spoken for me the way you apparently did today," she said finally. "Bethan told me what you said to my sisters." Bastion studied her face in the dim reflected light of the rain-streaked windows. "Everything I said was true." Azanor shook her head gently. "That is what makes it so painful to hear. When cruelty confirms what you fear, it is easier to bear than kindness that contradicts it. Something shifted permanently inside Bastian hearing those words. Not the sharp crack of recognition he had felt watching the Falcon land on her shoulder weeks earlier. Something deeper. Something that felt like the slow turning of a key inside a lock he had believed rusted, permanently shut. That night, long after leaving the estate, Bastian sat inside his carriage, beneath the glow of a small lantern, while rain hammered against the wooden roof above him. Resting silently in his coat pocket was a ring he had commissioned 3 weeks earlier from a jeweler in London. A single diamond, surrounded by pale blue sapphires, set in a band of white gold. Sarath sat hooded on the seat beside him, calm and still. He had not yet decided when to ask the question the ring was built for, but for the first time in years, the decision felt less like a risk and more like an inevitability he had simply been too damaged to recognize sooner. The autumn charity gala at Hearthome Palace carried the kind of grandeur designed to remind ordinary people that another world existed entirely above them. Crystal chandeliers the size of small carriages hung from painted ceilings, while marble floors polished to mirrors stretched beneath the feet of England's highest aristocracy. Long banquet tables overflowed with roasted swan, honeyed lamb, towers of sugared pastries, and crystal decanters of champagne that servants refilled before glasses ever reached empty. The entire hall hummed with influence, ambition, and wealth displayed without restraint. Azenor Delvain had never felt more out of place. Lady Fenella had dressed her carefully in silver silk, embroidered with tiny seed pearls that caught the light whenever she moved. Yet standing among younger women whose confidence seemed woven into their posture like thread into fabric, every old wound reopened silently inside her chest. Too old, unmarried, forgotten. The whispers she had endured for years did not need to be spoken aloud anymore. She carried them internally, a chorus that activated the moment she entered any room large enough to contain judgment. Her sisters noticed her discomfort instantly. Thessaly exchanged a glance with Cressida across the ballroom, and something cold passed between them. "He has not arrived yet," Cressida murmured with the faintest smile. Perhaps tonight she discovers what the rest of us already understand. Rowan sipped champagne in silence, though something that resembled satisfaction flickered briefly behind her careful expression. All 3 sisters believed the same unspoken prediction, that surrounded once again by younger, more beautiful, more strategically valuable women, Bastian would inevitably recognize the impracticality of his attention toward their eldest sister and redirect it toward someone whose presence made more logical sense beside a duke. Across the ballroom, Lady Lysara Corven entered wearing black velvet that caught the candlelight against her throat, like dark water reflecting stars. Conversations shifted in her direction immediately. Several women stepped aside as she moved through the crowd with the composed confidence of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of commanding attention without appearing to seek it. Then Duke Bastian Thornvale entered the hall. Sarath sat hooded upon his forearm, perfectly still. The Falcon's presence inside a formal gala drew immediate attention and murmured confusion. Bastian had never brought her to a public event of this scale before. Excitement swept visibly through the crowd. Noblewomen adjusted their posture and softened their voices. Ambitious mothers steered daughters into position with the precision of military commanders arranging formations. Lysara moved closer through the crowd, unhurried and deliberate, as though time itself would eventually deliver what patience demanded. Bastian noticed none of them. Azenor stood near the far edge of the ballroom, holding a crystal glass she had not lifted once to her lips, watching the evening unfold around her with the quiet resignation of someone who expected nothing except survival. Then she saw movement. Bastian had begun walking toward her, slowly, deliberately. The crowd parted around him without conscious thought. On his arm, Sereth stirred beneath her hood. Every woman in the room held her breath. Lysara's chin lifted with anticipation. Bastian walked directly past her. Past every face turned toward him with expectation. He stopped directly before Azenor. The ballroom fell into complete silence. Even the musicians paused, their bows hovering above strings, as though the air itself had become too heavy to move through. With his free hand, Bastian reached into his coat and produced a small velvet box. He opened it slowly. Inside rested the diamond ring, surrounded by pale blue sapphires that caught the candlelight and scattered it gently across Azenor's stunned face. Then the wealthiest duke in England spoke words that nobody inside Hearthome Palace expected to hear. "Miss Azenor Delvain," he said calmly, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. "I have spent years surrounded by people who valued beauty, charm, and status above all else. And I believed for a long time that those values were all the world contained." Nobody moved. Bastian's eyes never left Azenor's face. "But you possess something I had stopped believing existed. You carry kindness without performance, dignity without pride, and loyalty offered so quietly that the people closest to you never even recognized it was there." Tears burned immediately behind Azenor's eyes. "You treated servants with more genuine respect than most nobles extend to their equals," he continued. "You held this family together through labor they never acknowledged, and you endured cruelty that would have turned most hearts bitter. Yet yours remained gentle." Across the ballroom, Thessaly's face had drained of all color. Cressida stood frozen beside Hector, her emerald ring suddenly dull against the magnitude of what was unfolding before her. Rowan lowered her eyes completely, and Lady Fenella's face held something heavier than shock, something that looked, for the first time, like the weight of genuine regret. Bastian stepped closer. Even Serath leaned slightly forward on his arm, calm and still, as though the Falcon understood the importance of what was happening. "And there is no woman in England I respect more than you. Azenor, will you do me the honor of becoming my Duchess?" The sound that escaped Azenor was not a word. It was something that had been locked inside her chest for years, a broken release of grief and disbelief, and a kind of joy she had long ago stopped believing she was permitted to feel. Tears spilled openly down her face, while her trembling hands rose to cover her mouth. For several seconds, she could not speak. Years of humiliation, loneliness, and heartbreak pressed against her ribs all at once, colliding with something new and overwhelming that felt dangerously close to hope. Then she nodded through the tears. "Yes." The word left her lips barely above a whisper, but it carried across the silent ballroom like a bell struck in an empty cathedral. Applause erupted. Serath lifted her wings briefly, then settled calmly, as though the outcome had never been in question. Lady Lysara turned away from the scene and disappeared into the crowd without a word. Whispers exploded through the hall in every direction. Thessaly stared at her eldest sister, as though seeing a stranger for the first time. Cressida's confidence had collapsed completely behind her frozen expression. And Lord Hadwin Delvain sat at his table, motionless, watching the daughter he had once called the family's greatest failure stand beside the most powerful man in England, and felt the full weight of understanding arrive far too late to undo anything. Years passed after that evening. As Duchess of Ashenmore, Azenor became beloved throughout England, not because of her title or her husband's wealth, but because of the kindness she carried into every room and every role she occupied. She visited hospitals without announcement. She learned the names of every servant, tenant, and worker across the Thornvale estates, and remembered details about their families that most employers would never think to ask. She opened Ashenmore Manor during harsh winters to struggling families along the northern coast, providing warm meals, dry shelter, and medical attention arranged personally through physicians she funded from the estate accounts. People admired her because her goodness felt genuine. It was the same goodness that had always lived inside her. The only difference was that someone had finally recognized it. Sarath remained at Azanor's side for the rest of the Falcon's life, perching on her shoulder during morning walks along the coastal cliffs and resting on a stand beside the fireplace where Azanor and Bastian spent their evenings reading in comfortable silence. The bird that had trusted no one for 12 years never once showed aggression toward Azanor. Meanwhile, her sister's carefully constructed lives collapsed along the fractures that had been spreading for years. Viscount Alcott's gambling debts consumed Thessaly's household entirely before he disappeared abroad with a younger woman, leaving Thessaly alone in a half-furnished estate, with creditors knocking regularly at the door. Aldrich Cashmane buried himself so completely inside political scandal that Rowan became invisible inside her own marriage, a ghost haunting the corridors of a London townhouse where her husband rarely slept. Hector Grantham's controlling nature worsened with every passing season until society itself began to whisper about Cressida's increasingly rare public appearances and the sadness she could no longer hide behind expensive jewelry. One winter afternoon, several years after the engagement at Hartholme Palace, 3 familiar carriages arrived outside the gates of Ashenmore Manor. The women who stepped out were not the same women who had once mocked Azanor beside crystal chandeliers and champagne glasses. Their gowns were older. Their faces carried exhaustion where confidence once lived. Their posture had lost the architecture of pride that had once made them appear untouchable. Inside the grand drawing room, Azanor received her sisters calmly beside the fireplace, while snow fell in thick curtains beyond the tall windows overlooking the sea. None of her sisters could meet her eyes easily. Thessaly's hands trembled around her teacup. Rowan stared at the carpet with an expression that carried years of unspoken regret. Cressida opened her mouth twice to speak before any words actually emerged. Yet Azanor offered them tea. She offered them warmth. She offered them the kindness they had spent years mocking, without condition and without reminders of what they had done. Because in the end, the greatest victory was never revenge. It was becoming loved for the very heart they once dismissed as worthless. And England eventually learned what the Delvane family discovered far too late, that true worth was never carried inside beauty, youth, or status. It lived quietly inside loyalty, kindness, and the strength of a heart gentle enough to remain open after every reason the world gave it to close. Even a falcon understood that before they did.